She delivered twins amid the ashes of her burned homestead. Blood mixing with soot as labor pains racked her body among the charred remains of everything she'd ever known, until a Cheyenne scout emerged from the smoke-filled dawn and changed the course of 3 lives forever. Kansas Territory, September 1867. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of golden grass broken only by the occasional homestead or cattle trail. The Mason farm had stood for 3 years on this patch of government land, carved from the wilderness by Charlotte Mason and her husband Daniel, with nothing but determination and backbreaking work.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The fire had come in the night like a living thing, hungry and merciless. Charlotte had awakened to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling wood, her 8-month pregnant belly making it difficult to move quickly as she stumbled from the bed. The main house was already engulfed, flames licking at the roof beams and sending sparks dancing into the star-filled sky. "Daniel!" she had screamed, but there was no answer from the barn where her husband had gone to check on their livestock. The smoke was too thick, the heat too intense. She could barely make out the outline of buildings through the orange glow that had turned night into a hellish mockery of day. She had grabbed what she could, a quilt, a water pitcher, the small wooden box containing their savings, and fled into the prairie as the flames consumed everything they had built. Behind her, the house collapsed with a roar that sounded like the world ending, sending a column of sparks high into the darkness. For hours she had waited in the tall grass, praying that Daniel would emerge from the inferno, that somehow he had escaped with the animals, that this was all a nightmare from which she would soon awaken. But as dawn broke gray and smoky over the Kansas plains, she knew the truth. The fire had taken everything, her home, her husband, her future. Where the Mason homestead had stood, only blackened timbers and smoldering ash remained. The barn was a skeleton of charred beams. The chicken coop was gone entirely. Even the well pump was twisted and melted beyond recognition. 3 years of their lives had been reduced to ruins in a single night. Charlotte had searched through the debris with desperate hope, calling Daniel's name until her voice was raw. She found him near what had been the barn door, overcome by smoke while trying to free their horses. The animals were gone, too scattered by the fire or dead in the flames. She was alone in a landscape of devastation, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the children growing in her womb. The nearest neighbors were the Hendersons, 15 miles east, but Charlotte knew she couldn't make that journey in her condition. Her back had been aching for days, and sharp pains had been shooting through her belly since the fire started. She needed shelter, water, and help, but there was nowhere to turn. She had built a crude shelter from the least damaged timbers, creating a lean-to against the remains of the stone chimney. It provided minimal protection from the wind but kept the worst of the sun off her face. The well had survived the fire, though the pump mechanism was destroyed, so she could at least lower a bucket for water. It tasted of ash and smoke, but it was clean. For 2 days she had waited, hoping that someone would see the smoke, that travelers on the nearby cattle trail would investigate, that somehow rescue would come. But the Kansas prairie was vast and empty, and the few riders she glimpsed in the distance were too far away to hail. She was on her own in a way that city-raised women could never imagine. The labor pains had started on the 3rd morning, subtle at first but growing stronger. With each passing hour, Charlotte had helped deliver calves and foals, but human birth was different, especially when you were the one giving birth. She had no midwife, no doctor, no experienced woman to guide her through the process. She had only her own instincts and the grim determination that had carried her through 3 years of frontier life. By midday, the contractions were coming regularly, each one stronger than the last. Charlotte had spread the quilt inside her makeshift shelter and gathered what supplies she could. Fine clean rags torn from her spare dress, the sharp knife Daniel had used for butchering, a pot for water that had somehow survived the fire. She knew from helping animals that birth could be messy and dangerous, especially when complications arose. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the Kansas plains, and the shelter provided little relief from the heat. Sweat poured down Charlotte's face as she gripped the charred timber that supported her lean-to, breathing through contractions that seemed to tear through her entire body. The smell of ash and smoke still hung in the air, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Charlotte had expected a difficult birth, first babies often were, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of frontier childbirth without help. Each contraction felt like it might split her in half, and between them she could only rest and gather strength for the next wave of agony. As afternoon faded into evening, Charlotte realized something was wrong. The baby should have come by now, but despite hours of labor, nothing was happening. The pains were stronger than ever, but they seemed to be working against each other rather than moving the birth forward. She had seen difficult births in cattle, and the memory filled her with dread. In desperation, she tried different positions, squatting, lying on her side, even walking around the small shelter despite the pain. Nothing seemed to help. The baby was stuck somehow, and Charlotte didn't know enough about human anatomy to understand what was going wrong. All she knew was that both she and the child were in danger. Night fell over the prairie like a black curtain, broken only by the dying embers of what had once been her home. Charlotte lay on the quilt, exhausted and frightened, feeling the life inside her struggling as much as she was. She had never felt so alone in her life, surrounded by endless darkness and the whisper of wind through the grass. The pain reached a crescendo just before midnight, and Charlotte felt something give way inside her. Blood soaked the quilt beneath her, more blood than seemed normal, and she knew with cold certainty that she was dying. The baby or babies, she was beginning to suspect, were killing her with their struggle to be born, but she couldn't give up. These children were all she had left of Daniel, all that remained of their dreams for a family on the frontier. If she died, they died with her, and then the fire would have truly won. She gritted her teeth and pushed with everything she had, determined to bring her children into the world, even if it cost her everything. The first baby came suddenly, slipping into the world with a rush of blood and fluid that left Charlotte gasping. She caught the tiny, slippery form with trembling hands, wiping the birth matter from its face and listening with desperate hope for the sound of breathing. After a terrifying moment of silence, the baby girl let out a thin wail that was the most beautiful sound Charlotte had ever heard, but her relief was short-lived. The contractions started again immediately, even stronger than before, and Charlotte realized with shock that there was another baby, twins, in her exhausted state. She had missed the signs, but now there was no doubt. She was going to give birth to 2 children alone in the ashes of her burned home. The second birth was even more difficult than the first. Charlotte was already exhausted, already weak from blood loss, and the baby seemed larger than its twin. She pushed until she thought her body would tear apart, until she was sure she couldn't survive another moment, until finally the second child emerged into the world with a strength that spoke of survival against all odds. This baby was a boy, larger and louder than his sister, announcing his arrival with cries that echoed across the empty prairie. Charlotte collapsed back against the charred timber, holding both babies against her chest, feeling their tiny hearts beating against her skin. She had done it. Against all odds, she had brought her children safely into the world, but now she faced an even greater challenge. She was alone on the frontier with newborn twins, no shelter except a crude lean-to, no food except what little she had salvaged from the fire, and no prospect of help for days or weeks. The babies needed warmth, regular feeding, and protection from the elements. Charlotte wasn't even sure she could keep herself alive, let alone 2 helpless infants. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Kansas plains, and with it came the full weight of Charlotte's situation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The babies had cried through most of the night, hungry and cold, despite her attempts to keep them warm. Her own body was racked with pain and exhaustion, and she could fever starting to build from infection or blood loss. She tried to nurse the babies, but her milk hadn't come in yet, and they remained fussy and unsatisfied. Charlotte knew that newborns could survive for a day or two without feeding, but after that, they would weaken quickly. She needed to get them to safety, but she could barely stand, let alone walk 15 miles to the nearest homestead. The morning brought other problems as well. Coyotes had been circling the ruins during the night, drawn by the smell of blood and birth. Charlotte could see their tracks in the ash around her shelter, and she knew they would be back. Wolves were an even greater threat, and there were rumors of mountain lions in the area. Predators could smell vulnerability from miles away. She had managed to get a small fire going using dry grass and splinters from the burned timbers, but fuel was limited and the flames provided only a little warmth. The September nights were getting cold, and within a few weeks, frost would be a real danger. The lean-to might protect them from wind and rain, but it would be useless against a Kansas winter. Water was another concern. The well was intact, but lowering and raising the bucket was exhausting work for someone in Charlotte's condition. She had managed to fill the pot and wash the babies, but every movement sent sharp pains through her body. She was getting weaker, not stronger, and she knew that soon she wouldn't be able to care for the children at all. As the sun climbed higher, Charlotte tried to take stock of her situation rationally. She had perhaps a day's worth of food, some hardtack and dried meat that had been stored in the root cellar and survived the fire. She had water as long as she could operate the bucket. She had minimal shelter and a small supply of fuel for fire. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to keep 3 people alive until help arrived. The babies were sleeping now, exhausted from their difficult entry into the world, but Charlotte knew they would wake soon demanding food she couldn't provide. She looked at their tiny faces, the girl delicate and fair like Daniel, the boy darker and stronger like herself, and felt her heart break with love and desperation. She had brought them into the world, but she might not be able to keep them in it. That's when she saw the smoke on the horizon, thin and distant, but unmistakably real. Someone was out there, perhaps a day's ride away, perhaps less. Charlotte struggled to her feet and waved the quilt over her head, hoping against hope that whoever was making that smoke might see her signal and investigate. But the smoke was too far away, and her own signal was too small. She sank back down beside her babies, feeling defeat wash over her like the tide. She had survived the fire, survived a difficult birth, brought 2 lives safely into the world, but now she was going to watch them all die slowly from exposure and starvation. The frontier was beautiful but merciless, and it didn't care about human dreams or human love. The babies stirred and began to cry again, their voices thin and desperate in the morning air. Charlotte gathered them close, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung, trying to give them what comfort she could. If these were to be their last hours together, she would make sure they felt loved. But as she rocked the twins and whispered words of comfort, Charlotte heard something that made her heart skip. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing moment. Someone was coming across the prairie, someone who might see the ruins and investigate. Charlotte held her breath and listened, afraid to hope, but unable to stop herself. The sound grew clearer, a single horse moving at a steady walk, in no particular hurry, but definitely approaching the burned homestead. Charlotte tried to call out, but her voice was weak from exhaustion and pain. Instead, she gathered what strength she had and began to wave the quilt again, praying that whoever was out there would see her signal and understand that lives hung in the balance. Through the morning haze, she could just make out a figure on horseback, still distant, but real. The rider sat straight and alert, scanning the landscape with the careful attention of someone who knew the frontier and its dangers. As the figure drew closer, Charlotte could see that it was a man, tall and dark-haired, wearing clothes that suggested both European and Native American influences. Hope flared in Charlotte's chest like a rekindled fire. Rescue was coming. Help was approaching, and her children might yet survive their harsh introduction to the world. She clutched the babies closer and waited, watching the mysterious rider approach through the smoke-hazed morning. Knowing that her life and the lives of her twins were about to change forever, the rider moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle, his horse picking its way carefully through the scattered debris of the burned homestead. Charlotte could see now that he was Native American, his long black hair braided with leather and small bones, his clothing a mixture of traditional buckskin and practical frontier wear. A rifle rested across his saddle, but his hands were relaxed on the reins, showing no sign of aggression or threat. As he drew closer, Charlotte could make out his features more clearly. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered face of someone who lived outdoors, high cheekbones, and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was something calm and deliberate about his movements, like water flowing around rocks, adapting to obstacles without fighting them. The horse stopped about 20 feet from Charlotte's makeshift shelter, and the rider studied the scene before him with careful attention. His gaze moved from the burned ruins to the crude lean-to, from Charlotte's obviously weakened condition to the small bundles she held against her chest. When their eyes met, Charlotte saw something she hadn't expected, compassion mixed with understanding, as if he had seen tragedy before and knew how to respond to it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Charlotte was suddenly aware of how she must look: blood-stained dress, ash-streaked face, hair matted with sweat and smoke, holding two newborn babies in the ruins of what had once been her home. She waited for judgment, for questions about what had happened, for the suspicious wariness that most whites showed toward Indians on the frontier. Instead, the man dismounted with smooth, economical movements and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he said simply, "I am a Hanu of the Cheyenne. You need help." His English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen and pronounced. Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The relief of finally having another human being present, someone who might help her keep her children alive, was almost overwhelming. Ahanu's eyes moved to the babies, and Charlotte saw his expression soften slightly. "Twins," he said, and there was something like reverence in his voice. "Born in fire. Very strong medicine. They were born last night," Charlotte managed to say, "during the storm. The fire took everything else." Ahanu nodded as if he understood more than her words conveyed. He looked around the ruins again, taking in details that Charlotte had been too exhausted and overwhelmed to process. "Your man?" he asked gently. "Dead in the barn fire. He tried to save the animals." Another nod, this one tinged with respect. Ahanu seemed to understand the frontier code that would drive a man to risk his life for livestock that represented survival itself. "You have been alone since the fire?" 3 days. "The babies came this morning, just before dawn." Ahanu's eyebrows rose slightly, and Charlotte saw something like admiration flicker across his features. 3 days alone after losing everything, then giving birth to twins without help, it was a feat of endurance that impressed even someone who had grown up in a culture that prized survival skills. "Water?" he asked, and when Charlotte pointed toward the well, he walked over to examine it. He tested the rope, checked the bucket, then lowered it carefully and brought up clear, cold water. He tasted it himself first, then brought a cup to Charlotte. The water was the best thing she had tasted in days, cool and clean and free of the ash taste that had contaminated everything else. Ahanu watched her drink, then filled the cup again and waited while she sipped more slowly. "Food?" he asked next, and Charlotte shook her head. a little hardtack in the root cellar, some dried meat. Not much. Ahanu walked to his horse and returned with a leather pouch. Inside were strips of dried buffalo meat, hard but nutritious, and some kind of dense cake made from berries and fat. He offered them to Charlotte, who accepted gratefully. The food was unlike anything she had eaten before, rich and filling, with flavors that spoke of prairie grass and wild herbs. It was clearly travel food, designed to sustain someone on long journeys, and Charlotte realized that this man might have been riding for days or weeks across the empty plains as she ate. Ahanu examined the babies with the careful attention of someone experienced with newborns. He didn't try to take them from her arms, but he observed their breathing, their color, their movements. "Strong," he said finally. "Both strong, the boy especially. But they need milk soon." Charlotte's heart sank. "I know, but my milk hasn't come in yet, and there's nothing else." Ahanu considered this problem with the same calm attention he had given everything else. "There are ways," he said. "My people know how to feed babies when mothers cannot. But it requires travel to find the right plants. I can't travel. I can barely stand. Then we make camp here. Wait for your strength to return. Find what we need nearby." The casual way he said, "We," sent a jolt through Charlotte. This stranger, this Cheyenne warrior who owed her nothing, was offering to stay and help her through the most dangerous time of her life. It was more kindness than she had any right to expect, more than many of her own people would have offered. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help us?" Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the horizon where smoke still rose from scattered embers. "I have lost children too," he said finally. "Know what it is to hold new life and fear it will slip away. No one should face that alone." The simple statement carried weight that went far beyond words. Charlotte understood that this man had experienced loss, had felt the terror of trying to keep fragile life alive in a hostile world. His offer of help came not from pity, but from recognition, one parent understanding another. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, the baby girl began to cry again, her thin wail cutting through the morning air. Charlotte tried to comfort her, but without milk, there was little she could do. The boy stirred restlessly as well, both infants responding to hunger they couldn't understand. Ahanu listened to their cries with a focused intensity, as if the sound contained information he could interpret. "They are strong," he said again. "But hunger weakens quickly. We must act today." He stood and walked back to his horse, returning with what looked like a medicine bag, a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork and containing various plant materials. He sorted through the contents carefully, selecting several dried herbs and roots. "This is milkweed," he said, showing Charlotte a white, sticky substance from one of the plants. "Mixed with water, it can feed babies for a short time. Not as good as mother's milk, but enough to keep them alive until yours comes." Charlotte watched as he prepared the mixture with the precision of someone who had done this before, crushing the plant material and mixing it with clean water until it formed a thin, milky liquid. He tested it carefully, then showed her how to dip a clean cloth in the mixture and let the baby suck on it. The process was slow and messy, but both infants responded eagerly to the makeshift feeding. Their cries subsided as they got small amounts of nourishment, and Charlotte felt a surge of hope. Maybe they could survive this. Maybe her children would live to see their first birthday. "This will work for 1, maybe 2 days," Ahanu said as they watched the baby settle into sleep. "But we need better solution. Need to find doe with milk or cow that survived the fire somewhere nearby." Charlotte shook her head. The nearest livestock would be at the Henderson place, 15 miles east. "I can't make that journey yet." "Then we bring help here," Ahanu said simply. "I will ride to neighbors, tell them what happened. Bring back what is needed." The offer was generous beyond anything Charlotte had imagined, but it also highlighted the precariousness of her situation. She would be trusting her life and her children's lives to a man she had known for less than an hour. A Cheyenne warrior in a territory where tensions between Indians and settlers ran high. But what choice did she have? Without help, she and the babies would die within days. And something in Ahanu's manner, his calm competence, his gentle handling of the situation, his obvious experience with children, convinced her that he could be trusted. The Hendersons are good people, she said. Tell them Charlotte Mason needs help. Tell them about Daniel, about the fire. They'll come. Ahanu nodded and began preparing for the journey, checking his horse's gear and gathering supplies. But before he left, he built up Charlotte's fire and arranged several piles of wood within easy reach. He also showed her how to prepare more of the milkweed mixture and demonstrated a way to signal for help, using smoke if other travelers passed. I will return before dark, he promised, swinging up onto his horse with fluid ease. Keep the babies warm, keep them fed with the plant milk. Rest as much as you can. Your body needs time to heal. As he rode away across the prairie, Charlotte felt a complex mixture of gratitude and anxiety. She was still alone with 2 newborns in the ruins of her burned home, still facing challenges that would test every ounce of her frontier resilience. But for the first time since the fire, she had hoped that they might all survive. The babies slept peacefully in her arms, their bellies no longer empty, their tiny faces relaxed in the deep sleep of infancy. Charlotte held them close and watched Ahanu's figure grow smaller in the distance, wondering what strange providence had brought this Cheyenne warrior to her aid at the moment she needed help most. The hours after Ahanu's departure stretched endlessly across the Kansas prairie like shadows at sunset. Charlotte found herself listening for hoofbeats that didn't come, watching the horizon for dust clouds that never appeared, counting the minutes between the babies' feeding times with growing anxiety. The milkweed mixture was working, but she could see it wasn't enough. The twins were getting weaker despite her efforts, their cries becoming more feeble with each passing hour. She had arranged herself as comfortably as possible in the lean-to, using the quilt to create a nest that would keep the babies warm while allowing her to rest between feedings. But rest was elusive when every sound might signal danger, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of grass that could hide approaching predators, the creak of settling timbers that reminded her how precarious her shelter really was. The September sun climbed higher, bringing heat that made the ash-covered ground shimmer like water. Charlotte's makeshift shelter provided some shade, but the air inside grew stifling, and she worried about the babies overheating in their blankets. She tried moving them to different positions, fanning them with a piece of charred wood, even dampening their foreheads with precious water. By midday, her own condition was deteriorating rapidly. The fever she had felt building since dawn was now unmistakable, sending chills through her body despite the heat. Her vision blurred occasionally, and she found herself struggling to remember simple tasks like how much milkweed to mix with the water. Blood loss, exhaustion, and the beginning of infection were taking their toll. The baby girl, who had been the stronger of the twins at birth, was now showing signs of serious distress. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. Charlotte tried desperately to get more of the plant mixture into her, but the infant seemed too weak to suck properly. Fear gripped Charlotte's heart as she realized she might be about to lose one of the children she had fought so hard to bring into the world. The boy was faring better, his stronger constitution serving him well in these first crucial hours of life. He took the milkweed mixture more eagerly and slept more peacefully between feedings. But even he was showing signs of the stress that came with being born into such harsh circumstances. Charlotte held both babies constantly now, afraid that if she put them down, she might not have the strength to pick them up again. As afternoon wore on, Charlotte began to face the terrible possibility that Ahanu might not return at all. Perhaps he had encountered trouble on the trail. Perhaps the Hendersons weren't at home, or had refused to help. Perhaps he had simply decided that 3 desperate strangers weren't worth the risk of getting involved in frontier troubles. She had trusted him based on instinct and desperation, but she barely knew anything about him. The shadows were growing longer when Charlotte heard it, a sound that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Not the single set of hoofbeats she had been listening for, but multiple horses moving at a steady pace across the prairie. She struggled to her feet, clutching the babies against her chest, and peered out from her shelter toward the approaching riders. Through the heat haze, she could make out 3 horses carrying 4 people. Ahanu was in the lead, his familiar silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him rode a woman in a dark dress and bonnet, and behind her a man who looked like a farmer or rancher. The 4th rider was younger, probably a teenage boy. They were leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Relief flooded through Charlotte so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Help was coming, real help. People who could provide the medical care and nourishment that she and the babies desperately needed. She waved weakly from her shelter and saw Ahanu raise his hand in response before urging his horse to a faster pace. The woman dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, her movements quick and purposeful as she hurried toward Charlotte's shelter. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair and the competent bearing of someone accustomed to frontier emergencies. Her dress was practical calico, and she carried a leather medical bag that spoke of experience with childbirth and frontier medicine. "Mrs. Mason, I'm Margaret Henderson," she said, her voice warm with genuine concern. "Ahanu told us what happened." "Oh, you poor dear, let me see those babies." Charlotte found herself crying with relief as capable hands took charge of the situation. Margaret Henderson examined the twins with the skill of someone who had delivered many children and raised 6 of her own. Her husband Thomas, a weathered man with kind eyes, began unloading supplies from the pack horse while their son Billy, perhaps 16 years old, started building a proper fire. "The girl is in distress," Margaret said after a quick examination, "but she's still fighting. The boy is stronger, but both of them need proper feeding immediately." Thank goodness Ahanu knew to give them the milkweed. It probably saved their lives. From her medical bag, Margaret produced a small glass bottle with a rubber nipple as a feeding bottle that allowed infants to take milk more easily than sucking on cloth. She also had a tin of condensed milk, which she mixed with warm water to create a nourishing substitute for breast milk. Charlotte watched in amazement as both babies responded eagerly to this proper feeding method. "We brought a milk cow," Thomas Henderson said, nodding toward an animal that Billy was tethering nearby. "She's gentle and gives good milk. That should keep the little ones fed until your own milk comes in." The practical efficiency of the Hendersons was overwhelming after 3 days of desperate improvisation. Within an hour, they had transformed Charlotte's precarious situation into something approaching safety. A proper tent had been erected to replace the crude lean-to. Clean blankets and clothing had been provided. A substantial meal was cooking over a well-built fire. Margaret examined Charlotte herself, checking for signs of infection or complications from the difficult birth. "You've lost a good deal of blood," she said with professional concern. "And you're running a fever. But nothing that rest and proper care won't cure. You're a strong woman, Mrs. Mason, stronger than you probably realize." As evening approached, the babies were sleeping peacefully after their first proper feeding in hours. Charlotte herself was feeling better than she had since before the fire, thanks to Margaret's herbal medicines and Thomas's hearty beef stew. For the first time in days, she began to believe that they were all going to survive. But it was Ahanu's presence that affected her most deeply. He had kept his promise to return before dark, and more than that, he had brought exactly the help she needed. He moved quietly around the expanded camp, assisting where needed but never intruding on the Hendersons' medical work. There was something deeply reassuring about his calm competence. "That's a good man," Margaret said quietly. following Charlotte's gaze toward Ahanu as he tended to the horses. Rode near 20 miles to find us, then convinced Thomas to come immediately despite the harvest work waiting. Said you had twins born in ashes and needed help right away. Twins born in ashes, Charlotte repeated. That's what he called them before, said it was strong medicine among his people. Twins are considered very special, Margaret explained. Double blessing, double strength. And to be born during a time of destruction and still survive that would be seen as very powerful medicine indeed. Charlotte studied Ahanu's profile as he worked with the horses, noting the careful attention he paid to each animal's needs. There was something almost ritualistic about his movements, as if caring for the horses was a form of meditation or prayer. She found herself wondering about his life, his family, his reasons for traveling alone across the dangerous frontier. Mrs. Henderson, she said quietly, what do you know about him? About Ahanu? Margaret was silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Thomas has traded with his band for several years. They're peaceful people, trying to live traditional lives while adapting to all the changes coming to the territory. Ahanu is respected among them as a scout and tracker. But he spends a lot of time traveling alone. Why alone? Lost his family 3 years ago. Disease swept through their camp, cholera, I think. His wife and 2 young children died within a week. He's been traveling the old trails ever since, like he's looking for something he can't find in one place. The information hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Ahanu had lost children, just as he had said, but the reality was more devastating than she had imagined. No wonder he had shown such immediate understanding of her situation, such instinctive knowledge of how to care for newborns. He was drawing on memories of his own children, skills learned in happier times. That night, Charlotte lay in the comfort of a proper tent, listening to her baby's steady breathing and the sounds of a well-organized camp. The Hendersons had insisted on taking the first watch, leaving Charlotte free to rest for the first time since the fire. But sleep eluded her as she processed everything that had happened. Through the tent flap, she could see Ahanu sitting by the fire, keeping his own quiet vigil. He wasn't part of the Henderson family's familiar routines, but he wasn't exactly separate from them either. He existed in his own space, contributing to the group's welfare while maintaining his independence. Around midnight, one of the babies woke crying, and Charlotte emerged from the tent to feed him by the firelight. Ahanu looked up from where he was tending the flames, offering her a seat on a log he had positioned at the perfect distance from the fire's warmth. The boy is strong, he said quietly, watching as Charlotte settled the infant against her shoulder to burp him. He will grow to be a leader, I think. The girl too, once she gains her strength. You really believe that? About twins being special medicine? I believe that children born in times of great trial carry the strength of their birth with them always, Ahanu replied. Your babies survived fire, birth without help, 3 days of hunger. They are marked by survival. Charlotte found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of sorrow as well as wisdom. Mrs. Henderson told me about your family. I'm sorry for your loss. Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. My son would have been 4 this winter. My daughter was just learning to walk when the sickness came. Sometimes I think I can still hear their voices on the wind. The pain in his voice was raw despite the years that had passed. Charlotte understood that grief, the way it could ambush you at unexpected moments, the way it made you question everything you thought you knew about the world. Is that why you helped us? Because of them, perhaps. Or perhaps because life is precious and should not be wasted when it can be saved. He looked directly at her then, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Your children have a chance to grow up strong and free. That is worth protecting. The simple statement carried profound weight. Charlotte realized that for Ahanu, helping her wasn't charity or obligation. It was a way of honoring the children he had lost by protecting the children who still lived. It was an act of faith in the future, despite the tragedies of the past. Over the following days, as Charlotte slowly regained her strength, and the babies grew visibly stronger, she began to understand how naturally Ahanu fit into their improvised family structure. He didn't try to take charge or make decisions, but his presence added a layer of security that went beyond simple numbers. He knew things that the Hendersons, for all their frontier experience, did not. Which plants could be used for medicine, how to read weather patterns days in advance, how to track game and predict the movements of predators. He shared this knowledge freely, teaching Billy Henderson to identify useful plants and showing Thomas better ways to secure their supplies against animal raids. But it was with the babies that Ahanu showed his gentlest side. He carved tiny toys from wood scraps, simple shapes that newborns could grip safely, painted with natural dyes and colors that would catch infant eyes. He sang soft songs in his own language that seemed to calm them when they were fussy. He had an intuitive understanding of their needs that complemented Charlotte's maternal instincts. He would have been a good father, Margaret Henderson observed one morning as they watched Ahanu playing with the twins while Charlotte rested. You can see it in how he handles them, confident but gentle, protective but not possessive. Charlotte found herself watching these interactions with growing appreciation. Ahanu treated her children as if they were genuinely precious to him, not just responsibilities he had taken on out of duty. When he looked at them, she saw the same expression she remembered from her husband's face, the wonder of adults encountering the miracle of new life. "What will happen when I'm strong enough to travel?" she asked Margaret quietly. "The Hendersons have their own farm to worry about, and Ahanu has his own life to live. I can't expect everyone to reorganize their world around me and two babies." "That's something you'll need to figure out," Margaret replied honestly. "The territory is changing fast, and a woman alone with infants faces real challenges. But you're not alone right now, and maybe that's enough to start with." The words stayed with Charlotte as she contemplated her future. The fire had destroyed not just her home, but her entire plan for life on the frontier. She couldn't rebuild the farm alone, couldn't work the land while caring for two babies, couldn't even protect herself from the dangers that were part of daily life in Kansas Territory. But looking around the camp at the Hendersons' practical kindness, at Ahanu's quiet competence, at her babies growing stronger each day, she began to see the possibility of a different kind of future, not the one she had planned with Daniel, but something new and unexpected that might grow from the ashes of tragedy. As the sun set on their fourth day together, Charlotte sat by the fire nursing both babies simultaneously, a skill Margaret had taught her that morning. Ahanu sat nearby, carving another toy and humming one of his traditional songs. The Hendersons were discussing plans for the next day's travel, but Charlotte found herself wondering if she really wanted to leave this place where she had found unexpected safety. The ruins of her old life surrounded them, but somehow they no longer looked like endings. In the firelight, with her children healthy and content in her arms, and people who cared about their welfare nearby, the burned timbers looked more like the foundation for something entirely new. 2 weeks had passed since the fire, and Charlotte's temporary camp had evolved into something resembling a small settlement. The Hendersons had extended their stay far beyond their original plans, helping Charlotte regain her strength while Thomas and Billy worked to salvage anything useful from the burned homestead. What they discovered buried beneath the collapsed barn would change everything. "Mrs. Mason, you need to see this," Thomas called from where he had been clearing debris near the foundation stones. His voice carried an odd mixture of excitement and concern that made Charlotte look up from where she was washing the babies in a basin of warm water. Charlotte handed the twins to Margaret and walked carefully across the ash-strewn ground to where Thomas stood beside a partially excavated hole. The barn's collapse had apparently concealed a root cellar that neither she nor Daniel had known existed. Thomas had uncovered wooden planks that covered what looked like a substantial underground chamber. Daniel never mentioned this, Charlotte said, studying the hidden cellar with growing curiosity. We thought we knew every inch of this property, Billy. Henderson had already pried up several of the covering planks, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, suggesting that the cellar had remained sealed and intact despite the fire. Above, Thomas lowered a lantern into the space, and the flickering light revealed something extraordinary. The cellar was larger than the entire footprint of the barn above it, carved directly into the hard prairie soil and reinforced with carefully fitted stones. Along the walls stood wooden shelves and storage containers, all apparently untouched by the fire. But it was what lay in the center of the space that made Charlotte gasp with shock. Wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked in precise rows and marked with symbols that looked like military designations. Thomas climbed down the steps with his lantern, and his voice echoed strangely in the confined space as he read the markings aloud. U.S. Army Ordnance. Rifles, ammunition, medical supplies. He moved deeper into the cellar, his lantern illuminating more crates. There's enough military equipment down here to outfit a cavalry company. This wasn't just a root cellar, it was an arsenal. Charlotte felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet as the implication sank in. Daniel had never served in the army, had never mentioned any involvement with military affairs. Yet here, beneath the farm they had built together, was evidence of activities she had never suspected. Ahanu appeared at the cellar entrance, his expression carefully neutral as he studied the scene below. But Charlotte caught something in his eyes, not surprise, but recognition. As if he had suspected something like this might exist. You knew, she said to him, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew there was something here. Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. I knew your husband was not only a farmer, he said finally. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them, the way he positioned his buildings, the routes he chose for travel, the people who visited but never stayed long. Thomas emerged from the cellar carrying a leather portfolio he had found among the supplies. Inside were documents that revealed the truth about Daniel Mason's secret life military correspondence, payment records, and detailed maps showing locations throughout Kansas Territory where weapons and supplies had been cached. Your husband was a Union Army quartermaster, Thomas said, his voice heavy with implications Charlotte was only beginning to understand. He was responsible for establishing hidden supply depots in case Confederate forces moved into Kansas Territory. This farm wasn't just your home, it was a strategic military installation. The revelation hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Everything she had thought she knew about her marriage, about Daniel's work, about their life together, had been built on carefully maintained deceptions. The man she had loved and trusted had been living a double life, involving her in military operations without her knowledge or consent, but the implications went far beyond personal betrayal. If word of this arsenal spread, it would attract attention from every faction in the territory. Union loyalists who wanted the weapons secured, Confederate sympathizers who wanted them destroyed, and opportunists who simply wanted to profit from military hardware. Charlotte and her babies would become targets in conflicts they had nothing to do with. We have to keep this secret, Margaret said urgently, understanding the danger immediately. If the wrong people learn about this cache, they'll come looking for it. And they won't care who gets hurt in the process. That evening, as the babies slept and the Hendersons discussed their options in hushed tones, Charlotte found herself walking to the edge of the burned homestead with Ahanu. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the stars overhead seemed unusually bright in the clear prairie sky. How long have you known? She asked, her voice carrying all the confusion and betrayal she felt. How long have you known that Daniel was more than a farmer? Ahanu was quiet for several minutes, choosing his words with characteristic care. I first saw your husband 2 years ago, at a trading post near Fort Laramie. He was meeting with cavalry officers, discussing supply routes and defensive positions. It was clear he was working for the army, but not as a regular soldier. And you never said anything? Never warned me. What would I have said? That? Your husband had business you didn't know about? That was between you and him. My people have learned not to interfere in white men's marriages or military affairs. Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest, but she wasn't sure whether it was directed at Ahanu for keeping secrets or at Daniel for creating them in the first place. Those weapons could have gotten us all killed. Confederate raiders, hostile tribes, outlaws, any of them would have attacked the farm if they had known what was hidden here. Yes, Ahanu agreed simply. Your husband put you in danger without telling you. That was wrong. But he also tried to protect you by keeping you ignorant of the danger. That was also wrong, but for different reasons. The blunt assessment of Daniel's moral choices stung, but Charlotte recognized its accuracy. Her husband had been trying to serve his country and protect his family simultaneously, but his methods had compromised both goals. There's something else, Ahanu said, his voice carrying a weight that made Charlotte look at him sharply. The fire that destroyed your farm, I don't think it was an accident. The words sent a chill through Charlotte that had nothing to do with the evening air. What do you mean? The burn pattern was wrong for a natural fire. Too concentrated. Too complete. And there were horse tracks around the property that didn't match your husband's animals. Several riders, arriving and leaving together. Charlotte felt the world tilt around her as she processed what Ahanu was suggesting. You think someone deliberately burned us out? Someone who knew about the weapons cache. I think someone came looking for the arsenal and your husband tried to stop them. The fire was meant to cover their tracks and eliminate any witnesses. They probably didn't know about you being pregnant, didn't expect anyone to survive. The implications were staggering. Daniel's death hadn't been a tragic accident, it had been murder. The fire that had destroyed her life had been deliberately set by people who wanted the military supplies hidden beneath their farm. She and her unborn children had been meant to die as well. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because knowing wouldn't have changed anything, and you had enough to worry about keeping yourself and the babies alive. But now that we've found the cache, you need to understand the full situation. Charlotte sank down onto a fallen log, overwhelmed by the weight of revelations that kept reshaping everything she thought she knew about her life. What am I supposed to do with this information? How am I supposed to protect my children from people I can't even identify? Ahanu sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in the darkness. The same way you've been protecting them since the fire by being strong, by accepting help when it's offered, and by making choices based on their welfare rather than your own fears. But this changes everything. Those weapons make us targets. As long as that cache exists, people will keep coming for it. Then we make sure they can't find it. Ahanu said simply. Or we make sure they find something else instead. Charlotte looked at him sharply, hearing something in his tone that suggested he already had a plan forming. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that military supplies belong with the military, not buried under a burned farm where they put innocent people in danger. And I'm thinking that the right people might be very grateful to learn about a weapons cache that's been missing from army inventories for 2 years. The next morning brought unexpected visitors that would test everyone's ability to keep dangerous secrets. Charlotte was nursing the babies when Billy Henderson came running from his watch post on a nearby hill, his young face flushed with excitement and concern. "Riders coming," he called breathlessly. "Looks like a military patrol, but they're flying a flag I don't recognize. Maybe 8 or 10 men, all armed." Thomas Henderson immediately began organizing their small camp for potential trouble, while Margaret gathered the medical supplies and prepared to move the babies to safety, if necessary. But it was Ahanu's reaction that caught Charlotte's attention. Instead of preparing for conflict, he was studying the approaching riders with intense concentration. "I know that flag," he said after a moment. "It's a Cherokee cavalry unit, serving with the Union Army. If they're here, it means someone reported suspicious activity in this area." The patrol reached their camp within minutes, led by a man who was clearly of mixed Cherokee and European heritage. He wore a Union Army captain's uniform, but carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to operating independently of regular military hierarchy. "I'm Captain Joseph Ridge," he announced, dismounting and approaching their group with professional courtesy. "We're investigating reports of Confederate activity in this area. Are you folks having any trouble with raiders or suspicious strangers?" Charlotte felt her heart racing as she realized this was exactly the kind of military attention that could either save them or destroy them, depending on how they handled the situation. Thomas Henderson stepped forward to respond, but Ahanu moved to intercept him. "Captain Ridge," Ahanu said, offering a respectful nod. "I am Ahanu of the Cheyenne. We have met before, at the Peace Council in Medicine Lodge." Recognition flickered across the captain's features, followed by what looked like genuine respect. "Ahanu, yes. You were one of the scouts who helped track the stolen cavalry horses last spring. What brings you to this part of the territory?" "I am helping this woman and her children," Ahanu replied, gesturing toward Charlotte and the babies. "Her farm was burned by raiders 2 weeks ago. Her husband was killed trying to protect their livestock." Captain Ridge's expression softened as he looked at Charlotte and the twins. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Do you know anything about the men who attacked your farm? Any identifying marks or details that might help us track them?" Charlotte found herself at a crossroads that would determine the future safety of her children. She could continue the deception that Daniel had been simply a farmer, keeping the weapons cache secret, but leaving herself vulnerable to future attacks. Or she could trust this Cherokee officer with the truth and hope that military protection was stronger than military bureaucracy. "Captain," she said, making her decision with the same instinct that had carried her through childbirth and survival. "I think my husband was involved in something that got him killed. Something military. And I think there are people who will keep coming for whatever they believe is hidden here." The captain's attention sharpened immediately, his casual manner replaced by focused military interest. "What kind of military involvement, Mom?" "Thomas." Henderson looked alarmed at Charlotte's directness, but Ahanu nodded approvingly. Sometimes the truth was the only path to safety, even when it was dangerous. "He was hiding weapons," Charlotte said simply. "Union Army supplies, cached beneath our barn. I didn't know about it until after the fire, but I think the raiders who killed him were trying to find those weapons." Captain Ridge exchanged glances with his sergeant, a full-blooded Cherokee who had been quietly observing the conversation. Both men understood the implications. Immediately missing military supplies represented both a security threat and an opportunity to strengthen their own unit's equipment. "Ma'am, if what you're saying is true, then you and your children are in serious danger. There are Confederate sympathizers and outlaw gangs throughout this territory who would kill for access to Union Army weapons. But there are also Union forces who would protect you in exchange for information about those supplies." "What kind of protection?" Charlotte asked, thinking not of her own safety but of her children's future. "The kind that comes with official military recognition and ongoing support," Captain Ridge replied. "The Army takes care of the families of those who serve the Union. 'Cause even if that service was unofficial, your husband was apparently a patriot who died protecting federal property. That makes you eligible for military assistance." The offer was more than Charlotte had dared hope for, not just immediate protection, but long-term security for herself and the twins. But it also meant accepting that her life was now permanently entangled with military and political conflicts she had never chosen to be part of. "There's one more thing you should know," Ahanu said to Captain Ridge, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used when discussing sensitive matters. The attack on this farm was planned and deliberate. Someone with detailed knowledge of the weapons cache location organized the raid. This wasn't random Confederate activity, it was targeted theft. Captain Ridge's expression darkened as he processed the implications. You're suggesting there's a traitor in the Union command structure? Someone who's been selling information about weapons cache locations. I'm suggesting that whoever burned this farm knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. That kind of specific intelligence doesn't come from lucky guesses or random scouting. The Cherokee officer studied the burned ruins with new eyes, seeing them not as the scene of a tragic accident, but as evidence of military espionage and betrayal. "Ma'am," he said to Charlotte, "I think you're going to need more protection than just my patrol can provide. And I think the Union Army is going to be very interested in everything you can tell us about your husband's activities." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie, Charlotte found herself agreeing to travel with Captain Ridge's patrol to Fort Harker, where she could provide detailed information about the weapons cache in exchange for military protection. It wasn't the future she had planned, but it offered something more valuable than independence. It offered safety for her children in a world that had proven far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But as she prepared to leave the site of her burned farm, Charlotte realized she was also leaving behind the last vestiges of her old life. The woman who had been simply Daniel Mason's wife was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival on the frontier required not just strength and determination, but the wisdom to know when to trust strangers with your life. Fort Harker rose from the Kansas prairie like a wooden island in an ocean of grass. Its high walls and guard towers, a stark reminder that civilization on the frontier existed only through constant vigilance. Charlotte had never seen a military installation before, and the organized chaos of soldiers, supply wagons, and official business was overwhelming after weeks of living in temporary camps. The fort's commanding officer, Colonel William Hayes, was a career military man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent fighting in places most civilians never heard of. He received Charlotte in his office with the formal courtesy reserved for civilians whose cooperation was essential to military objectives. But his questions were sharp and thorough. "Mrs. Mason, according to Captain Ridge's report, you're late. Husband was operating a weapons cache without direct authorization from this command. Can you explain how a civilian farmer came to possess Union Army ordnance worth several $1,000s? Charlotte held her babies closer as she tried to answer questions about a man she was realizing she had never truly known. Daniel never discussed his work with me, Colonel. I thought he was simply farming government land under the Homestead Act. I had no idea he was involved with military supplies." The colonel's aide, a nervous young lieutenant named Morrison, spread maps and documents across the desk as they spoke. Charlotte recognized some of the locations, marked on the maps trading posts and settlements she and Daniel had visited together, now revealed as strategic points in a network of hidden supply depots. "Your husband was part of a classified operation," Colonel Hayes explained, his tone suggesting that he was sharing information reluctantly. After the Lawrence Massacre and other Confederate raids into Kansas, the Army established hidden caches throughout the territory. If regular supply lines were cut, local commanders could access these weapons to continue resistance. But someone betrayed the cache locations, Captain Ridge added from where he stood near the window. "The attack on your farm was too precise, too well informed to be random. Someone with access to classified military information sold out your husband and the other cache operators." The implication sent a chill through Charlotte that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the office windows. Her husband hadn't just been killed for military supplies, he had been murdered by someone he trusted, someone within the Union command structure who was profiting from betraying their own forces. "Colonel," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "if there's a traitor in your command, how can you protect my children? How do I know that whoever killed Daniel won't learn where we are and try to finish what they started? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, highlighting the terrible vulnerability of her position. She was asking for protection from the very organization that might harbor her husband's killer. Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Ma'am, there have been other incidents. 3 cache operators have died in the past 6 months, supposedly. Accidents or random attacks. But the pattern suggests systematic elimination of anyone who knew cache locations." Colonel Hayes shot his aide a sharp look that could have stripped paint, but the damage was done. Charlotte now understood that she and her babies weren't just targets. They were the latest in a series of murders designed to cover up military corruption and theft. "What do you want from me?" she asked, cutting through the military protocol and political maneuvering. "What information do I have that's worth risking my children's lives?" "Your husband kept detailed records," the colonel replied, producing a leather journal that had apparently been recovered from the weapons cache. "Dates, locations, personnel involved in the cache network. But the records are in some kind of code, and without the key, they're useless." Charlotte took the journal with trembling hands, recognizing Daniel's careful handwriting but not understanding the symbols and abbreviated notations that filled each page. "I don't know anything about codes or military secrets. Daniel never shared this kind of information with me." But as she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye, a series of dates that corresponded to her own personal memories. Doctor visits during her pregnancy, trips to town for supplies, visits from neighbors. Daniel had been recording not just military information, but details about their domestic life as well. He was using our personal experiences as the basis for his code, she realized suddenly. These dates aren't random, they're significant. Events in our marriage. Wedding anniversary, my birthday, the day we first saw the farm. The breakthrough sent a jolt of excitement through the room. If Charlotte could decipher Daniel's personal coding system, she could unlock information that might identify the traitor and expose the entire conspiracy. But Captain Ridge's expression remained troubled. "Ma'am, if you can break that code, you'll become the most valuable and most dangerous person in Kansas territory. Every faction will want what you know: Union forces, Confederate sympathizers, and the traitors who are playing both sides." That evening, as Charlotte worked to decipher Daniel's journal in a secure room within the fort, a Hanu appeared at her window with information that changed everything. He had been scouting outside the fort's walls, using skills learned from a lifetime of reading signs and tracking movement across the prairie. "We are being watched," he said quietly, slipping through the window with the fluid grace that never ceased to amaze her. 3 men, positioned on hills overlooking the fort. "They have been there since we arrived, taking shifts to maintain constant observation." Charlotte looked up from the journal, feeling fear grip her heart. "Confederate spies? I don't think so. Their equipment is too good, their positioning too professional. These are military men, probably Union soldiers, but they're not part of the fort's official security." The implications were terrifying. If Ahanu was right, then someone within the Union command structure was already moving against them, positioning forces to strike. Before Charlotte could reveal what she had learned from Daniel's records, "How long do we have?" she asked, gathering the babies closer while continuing to work on the code. "Not long. They will move tonight, when fewer people are awake to witness what happens. It will be made to look like a Confederate raid. Unfortunate casualties in an enemy attack on the Precus Conwa fort." Charlotte's mind raced as she tried to process the information she had already decoded from Daniel's journal. The cache network was larger than anyone had admitted, involving not just weapons but also medical supplies, gold for purchasing intelligence, and detailed maps of Confederate troop movements. Someone with access to this network could make enormous profits by selling information to the highest bidder. "I need more time," she said desperately. "I'm close to identifying the key figures in the conspiracy, but I need at least another hour to decode the most important entries. Ahanu was. Already moving, checking his weapons and preparing for action. Then we create time. But not here. The fort is too controlled. Too many ways for enemies to manipulate the situation. We need to get you and the babies to somewhere we can defend. Where? We're in the middle of hostile territory, surrounded by people who want. US dead. We go to my people, Ahanu said simply. My band is camped 2 days' ride from here, in a place where no white soldiers can approach unseen. Among the Cheyenne, you and your children will be safe while you finish your work. The suggestion was both salvation and exile. Charlotte would be protected, but she would also be cut off from the military support she needed to make use of. Daniel's information. She would be safe but powerless. A commotion in the fort's courtyard interrupted her thoughts. Shouts, running footsteps, the sound of soldiers assembling for emergency duty. Through her window, Charlotte could see torches being lit and officers issuing urgent orders. What's happening? She asked, but Ahanu was already at the window, studying the activity with the intense focus of a predator sensing danger. False alarm, he said after a moment. Someone reported Confederate raiders approaching from the east, but I see no evidence of enemy forces in that direction. This is a diversion, designed to draw attention away from the real attack. Even as he spoke, Charlotte heard different sounds, quieter, more deliberate. Footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Men moving with purpose toward her door. The trap was closing, and they had only minutes before the enemy reached them. Ahanu moved to the door and listened carefully before turning back to Charlotte with grim determination. 4 men in the hallway, trying to be quiet but not succeeding. Military boots, disciplined movement. This is the real attack. Charlotte clutched the journal and her babies, her mind racing through impossible choices. She could surrender and hope that her captors would spare the children. She could try to fight and likely get everyone killed. Or she could trust Ahanu to get them out of what seemed like an inescapable situation. The window, Ahanu said, confirming her decision. I have horses waiting in the stable behind the building. If we move now, while they're focused on the front door, we can escape before they realize we're gone. The next few minutes passed in a blur of desperate action. Charlotte bundled the babies as quietly as possible while Ahanu rigged the door to delay their pursuers. The window was small, designed for ventilation rather than escape, but desperation gave them both the motivation to make it work. Charlotte went first, lowering the babies to Ahanu before climbing through herself. Behind them she could hear the soft sounds of men trying to force the door without creating noise that would alert the entire fort. They had perhaps 2 minutes before their escape was discovered. The horses were where Ahanu had promised, saddled and ready for immediate departure. He helped Charlotte mount while securing the babies in a specially designed carrier that would protect them during hard riding. As they rode away from Fort Harker under cover of darkness, Charlotte heard shouts and gunfire erupting behind them. The pursuit began before they had ridden a mile from the fort. Torches appeared behind them like angry stars, and the sound of multiple horses in hard pursuit carried clearly across the prairie night. Ahanu pushed their horses to the limit, but Charlotte knew they couldn't maintain this pace with 2 infants who needed care and protection. How far to your people? She called over the thunder of hoofbeats. Too far, Ahanu replied grimly. We need another plan. The babies were crying now, frightened by the violent motion and the cold night air. Charlotte tried to comfort them while maintaining her grip on the reins, but the situation was becoming impossible. They needed to find shelter and safety before the infants suffered serious harm from exposure. There, Ahanu pointed toward a dark line on the horizon. Creek bottom with trees. We can lose them in the brush if we reach it first. But their pursuers were gaining ground, the military horses fresher and faster than the mounts Ahanu had been able to secure. Charlotte could hear individual voices now, men calling orders and coordinating their attack. They would be overtaken within minutes. As if summoned by their desperation, help appeared from an unexpected direction. A group of riders emerged from a creek bed ahead of them, and Charlotte's heart sank until she recognized the lead figure, Captain Ridge, and his Cherokee cavalry. "Patrol, this way," Ridge called, wheeling his horse to lead them toward a narrow canyon that cut through the prairie like a hidden wound. "We'll make our stand where their numbers won't matter." The canyon was perfect for defense, narrow enough that attackers could only come a few at a time, with high walls that provided cover and multiple escape routes known only to those familiar with the terrain. Ridge's men took positions with professional efficiency, while Ahanu helped Charlotte and the babies find shelter among the rocks. "How did you know we were in danger?" Charlotte asked as they waited for the attack to begin. Ahanu sent word. "Before he came to warn you," Ridge replied, checking his rifle and ammunition. "We've been watching the Watchers, and we didn't like what we saw. Someone in the fort's command structure is definitely working with the enemy." The Cherokee warriors moved with silent precision, taking advantage of natural cover and superior knowledge of the terrain. Charlotte watched in amazement as they seemed to disappear into the landscape, becoming invisible even though she knew their approximate positions. "How many are following us?" she whispered to Ahanu as he crouched beside her shelter among the boulders. 8, maybe 10. All mounted, all armed with military weapons. "They're not trying to capture us, they're trying to eliminate witnesses." The grim assessment sent fear through Charlotte's heart, but also anger. These men had already killed her husband and tried to murder her and her newborn children. Now they were pursuing her across the prairie like she was some kind of dangerous criminal. "What about the journal?" she asked, clutching Daniel's coded records. "If something happens to me, how will anyone ever know the truth about the conspiracy?" "Nothing will happen to you," Ahanu said with quiet certainty. "Ridge and his men are the best fighters in Kansas Territory. And you still have work to do. That journal contains information that could save many lives." The battle, when it came, was brief but vicious. The attackers approached the canyon mouth with military precision, but they had underestimated their opponents. Ridge's Cherokee cavalry proved superior in night fighting and knowledge of the terrain, using the darkness and rocky terrain to their advantage. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, muzzle flashes lighting up the night. In brief, violent bursts. Charlotte held her babies close, trying to protect them from the sounds of combat while staying low enough to avoid stray bullets. The battle seemed to last forever, but she knew it was probably only minutes when the shooting stopped. 3 of the attacking soldiers were dead, and the rest had fled back toward the fort. Ridge's men had suffered only minor wounds, their superior tactics and knowledge of the terrain giving them decisive advantage over soldiers trained for conventional warfare. "They'll be back," Ridge said as his men secured the area and tended to their wounded. "Probably with more men and better equipment. We need to be far from here before dawn." As they prepared to resume their journey, Charlotte realized the full magnitude of what had just happened. Union soldiers had tried to murder her and her children to cover up military corruption. She was now officially a fugitive from her own government, wanted by forces that commanded vast resources and legal authority. "Captain Ridge," she said as they mounted fresh horses, "why are you helping us? You're risking your own command, your own men, for people you barely know." Ridge studied her face in the starlight before answering. "Because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following orders. Your husband died trying to protect Union Army property from thieves wearing Union Army uniforms. That makes him a hero and them traitors." During their ride through the remaining hours of darkness, Charlotte worked by starlight and moonlight to decipher more of Daniel's journal. The personal coding system was becoming clearer now that she understood the pattern. He had used significant dates and events from their marriage as the key to encrypting military information. "June 15th, she murmured to herself, remembering their wedding anniversary. That corresponds to the cache location near Abilene. And August 3rd, that was when we first saw the farm that's linked to the Fort Riley ammunition depot. Ahanu rode beside her, occasionally helping to hold the journal when she needed both hands to manage the babies. His presence was steady and reassuring as she worked through the complex code that had been her husband's final legacy. "What are you finding?" he asked as Charlotte made notes on a separate piece of paper. "Names," she said, her voice tight with anger and betrayal. Daniel recorded every person involved in the cache network, not just the operators like himself, but the commanding officers who authorized the operation, the suppliers who provided the weapons, and the administrators who handled the paperwork. But more disturbing were the notations that appeared to track suspicious incidents. Daniel had been documenting unusual activities for months before his death cache locations being compromised. Supplies going missing, operators reporting being followed or questioned by unauthorized personnel. He knew, Charlotte realized, with growing excitement. Daniel knew there was a traitor in the system. He was conducting his own investigation, trying to identify who was selling information about the caches. The revelation sent new urgency through their group. If Daniel had identified the traitor before his death, that information could expose the entire conspiracy and bring justice for all the cache operators who had been murdered. "There," Charlotte said, pointing to a series of coded entries near the end of the journal. "These entries are different, more detailed, more careful." He was building a case against someone specific, working by the light of a carefully shielded lantern. Charlotte decoded the final entries that Daniel had made just days before the attack on their farm. What she found there changed everything. She thought she knew about the conspiracy, Lieutenant Morrison. She breathed, recognizing the name of Colonel Hayes' nervous aide. Daniel identified Lieutenant Morrison as the source of the security breaches. He was selling cache locations to Confederate agents and criminal gangs, but the conspiracy went deeper than simple treason for money. Morrison had been working with a network of corrupt officials throughout the territory, using their access to military intelligence to profit from the war, while good soldiers died protecting information that was being sold to the enemy. "We have to get this information to honest military authorities," Charlotte said, clutching the decoded evidence. "But how do we know who can be trusted? If Morrison could operate freely under Colonel Hayes' command, how many other traitors are there?" Ridge had been listening to their conversation with growing interest. "There are honest officers in the Union Army," he said finally. "Men who joined to preserve the Republic, not to get rich from war profiteering. But they're not always easy to identify, and they don't always have the power to act against corruption in their own ranks. Then we find someone with both integrity and authority," Ahanu said with characteristic directness. "Someone whose reputation is beyond question and whose position gives them the power to investigate military corruption." "General Sherman," Ridge said after thinking for a moment. "He's in Kansas right now, conducting inspections of frontier commands. If anyone has the authority and the will to clean up this mess, it's Sherman." The plan was ambitious and dangerous, approaching one of the Union Army's most senior commanders, with accusations of conspiracy and treason against his own officers. But it was also their best chance of getting justice for Daniel and protection for Charlotte's children. As dawn broke over the Kansas prairie, Charlotte found herself free, but fugitive, protected by a Cherokee cavalry unit that operated outside normal military channels. She had Daniel's journal and the key to breaking his code, but she was now officially a deserter from military protection, wanted by forces she couldn't identify or trust. "What happens now?" she asked Ahanu as they prepared to continue their journey to his people's camp. "Now we finish what your husband started," he replied, studying the coded journal with new understanding. "We identify the traitors, expose the conspiracy, and make sure your children can grow up in a world where their father's sacrifice meant something." Charlotte looked at her sleeping babies, then at the vast prairie stretching endlessly in all directions. The future was uncertain, dangerous, and completely different from anything she had ever imagined. But for the first time since the fire, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than just running away. She had evidence that could bring down a network of traitors, allies who were willing to risk everything for justice, and the growing confidence that she could protect her children in a world that had proven far more complex and dangerous than she had ever realized. The Cheyenne camp materialized from the prairie landscape like something from a dream. Dozens of hide lodges arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of wisdom about wind patterns, water access, and defensive positioning. Charlotte had never seen a Native American village before, and the orderly beauty of it surprised her after years of hearing frontier stories about savage wilderness living. The camp was a marvel of practical organization that put many white settlements to shame. Each lodge was positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks while providing clear sight lines for security. A central area served as a gathering place for communal activities, while specialized areas were designated for different crafts, food preparation, and horse care. Children played safely in designated areas while adults worked efficiently at tasks that supported the entire community. Ahanu's people received them with the formal courtesy reserved for honored guests. But Charlotte could sense the undercurrent of concern that came with harboring fugitives from the United States Army. The camp's elder, a weathered man named Tall Bear, whose presence commanded immediate respect, listened carefully as Ahanu explained their situation in rapid Cheyenne. The conversation that followed was complex and nuanced, touching on questions of honor, obligation, and the delicate balance the Cheyenne maintained between protecting their people and maintaining peaceful relations with the expanding United States government. Charlotte couldn't understand the words, but she could read the body language and tone that indicated serious consideration of difficult choices. "He says you are welcome for as long as necessary," Ahanu translated after a lengthy discussion that involved several other tribal leaders. But he also says that bringing soldiers' troubles to the people's camp puts everyone at risk. "We must resolve this quickly, before the army decides to make the entire band pay for sheltering you." Charlotte understood the delicate position her presence created. These people were already walking a dangerous line between maintaining their traditional way of life and adapting to the massive changes sweeping across their territory. The recent Sand Creek massacre was fresh in everyone's memory, a brutal reminder of what could happen when government officials decided that Native Americans were obstacles to be eliminated rather than people to be respected. But the women of the camp showed no such political concerns as they welcomed Charlotte and her babies with the universal kindness that mothers show to other mothers in need. They provided clean clothing made from soft deerskin that was both practical and beautiful, nourishing food that combined traditional preparations with ingredients adapted from contact with white traders, and practical advice about caring for infants under difficult circumstances. "Your children are growing strong," said Morning Star, an elderly woman whose gentle hands seemed to work magic with fussy babies. She had raised 7 children of her own and helped deliver dozens more, giving her insights into infant care that proved invaluable. "The boy especially will be a warrior. See how he grips with his hands, how his eyes follow movement. But the girl has the eyes of one who sees far. She will be wise beyond her years." The observations proved remarkably accurate as Charlotte watched her twins respond to their new environment. The boy seemed to thrive on the activity and energy of camp life, while the girl was fascinated by the intricate beadwork and crafts that the women created during their daily activities. Both children were obviously benefiting from the stable, nurturing environment after weeks of uncertainty and danger. Charlotte found herself working feverishly to complete the decoding of Daniel's journal while the babies slept in the warm security of the lodge she had been given. The Cheyenne women had created a comfortable workspace for her, understanding instinctively that her mysterious papers were important to resolving the troubles that had brought her to their camp. The final entries contained the most damaging information, detailed records of meetings between Lieutenant Morrison and known Confederate agents, financial records showing payments for military intelligence that totaled thousands of dollars, and a list of Union Army personnel who had been compromised or eliminated to protect the conspiracy. Daniel had been building an airtight case against the traitors, gathering evidence with the methodical patience of a trained investigator. "This is enough to hang Morrison and half a dozen other officers," Captain Ridge said as he reviewed Charlotte's decoded translation by firelight. "But getting this information to the right authorities without being murdered in the process, that's the challenge we still face." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications. Morrison and his Confederates had been selling not just weapons and supplies, but detailed intelligence about Union troop movements, defensive positions, and strategic plans. The information they had provided to Confederate forces could have influenced the outcome of major battles and cost thousands of Union lives. "Look at this entry," Charlotte said, pointing to one of Daniel's most disturbing discoveries. Morrison sold the Confederate cavalry detailed maps of Union supply routes 3 days before the raid on Lawrence. He helped plan the massacre. The revelation sent a chill through everyone present. The Lawrence massacre had been one of the most brutal Confederate actions of the entire war, resulting in the deaths of nearly 200 civilian men and boys. To learn that a Union officer had helped facilitate that atrocity added a personal dimension to their mission that went far beyond military justice. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity, but complex in its execution. General Sherman's inspection tour would bring him to Fort Leavenworth within the week, accompanied by his own trusted staff and security detail. If they could intercept his party before it reached Leavenworth, they might be able to present their evidence directly to someone with both the authority and the integrity to act on it. "The risk is enormous," Ridge warned as they finalized their strategy around the central fire that served as the heart of Cheyenne community life. "If we're wrong about Sherman's character, or if the conspiracy reaches higher than we think, we'll all be arrested as traitors. Your children could end up orphaned, and my men could face court-martial and execution." But Ahanu had a different perspective on the risks they faced, one shaped by his people's long experience with survival in hostile circumstances. "If we do nothing, the killing continues. More cash operators die, more weapons are stolen, more good soldiers are betrayed by their own officers. Sometimes the greatest risk is in failing to act when action is needed." Charlotte looked at her sleeping babies, now healthy and content, in their soft deerskin cradle boards that the Cheyenne women had crafted with loving care. These children represented not just her own future, but the possibility of a world where justice and integrity could triumph over corruption and betrayal. The decision she made would determine what kind of legacy Daniel's sacrifice would leave. "We proceed," she said with quiet determination. "Daniel died trying to expose this conspiracy, and I won't let his death be meaningless. These children deserve to grow up in a world where their father's sacrifice brought justice rather than just more questions and suspicions." The next 3 days were spent in careful preparation that combined military planning with Cheyenne wisdom about reading the land and predicting the movements of both man and nature. Ridge's Cherokee cavalry would provide escort and security, while Ahanu used his knowledge of the territory to plan a route that would avoid Army patrols loyal to compromised officers and Confederate raiders who might be watching for any sign of the evidence they sought to suppress. Meanwhile, the babies were thriving in the stable environment of the Cheyenne camp. The twins were gaining weight steadily, sleeping peacefully through the night despite the activity around them, and beginning to show the distinct personalities that would shape their future lives. The boy was already showing signs of his father's determined nature, gripping toys with unusual strength and following movement with intense concentration. The girl displayed an alertness and curiosity that suggested exceptional intelligence, studying faces and sounds with the focused attention of someone processing complex information. General William Tecumseh Sherman's inspection convoy was an impressive display of military efficiency. 24 mounted soldiers riding in precise formation. Supply wagons organized with mathematical precision, communication equipment that allowed instant contact with distant commands, and the kind of disciplined organization that had made Sherman one of the Union's most effective commanders. Charlotte watched from concealment as the column approached the predetermined intercept point, her heart racing with the knowledge that the next few minutes would determine whether justice would be served, or whether she and her children would spend the rest of their lives as fugitives. The location chosen for the meeting was carefully selected to demonstrate peaceful intent while maintaining tactical advantage. A natural clearing beside a creek provided open ground where both parties could assess each other's intentions, while nearby hills offered escape routes if the confrontation went badly. Ridge had positioned his men carefully along the convoy's route, not as an attacking force but as a demonstration of strength that would command respect while avoiding the appearance of hostile intent. When they revealed themselves, it was with the formal military courtesy that one professional force shows to another, flags displayed properly and weapons visible but not threatening. Sherman's escort responded with professional alertness, recognizing the Cherokee Battalion's military bearing while maintaining readiness for potential trouble. "General Sherman," Ridge called out as he rode forward under a white flag, his uniform and bearing immediately identifying him as a legitimate military officer rather than a disguised raider. "I am Captain Joseph Ridge of the Cherokee Battalion, 2nd Brigade. I request a brief audience on a matter of urgent military importance affecting Union operations throughout Kansas Territory." Sherman's response revealed the pragmatic intelligence that had made him one of the war's most successful generals. Instead of dismissing the request or treating it as a potential ambush, he ordered his column to halt while he evaluated the situation with the careful attention of someone who understood that important information could come from unexpected sources. His experienced eye took in details that spoke of genuine military crisis rather than elaborate deception. "Captain Ridge," Sherman said after studying the Cherokee officer's uniform, bearing, and the obvious discipline of his men, "I remember your unit's service at Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge. You fought with distinction under difficult circumstances. What brings you here with such an unusual request for a field meeting?" Evidence of systematic treason within the Union Army command structure in Kansas Territory. Ridge replied without preamble, understanding that Sherman respected directness over diplomatic niceties. "We have documented proof of a conspiracy to steal weapons from secret military caches and sell detailed intelligence to Confederate agents and criminal organizations." The accusation sent a ripple of tension through Sherman's escort, hands moving instinctively toward weapons as officers considered the possibility of an elaborate Confederate trick designed to undermine confidence in Union command structure. But Sherman himself remained calm, his experienced eye taking in details that spoke of genuine military crisis rather than enemy deception. The general's ability to read people and situations had been honed by years of command, responsibility, and political maneuvering in Washington. He could see that Ridge was genuinely agitated rather than acting, that his men showed the kind of controlled tension that came from real danger rather than manufactured drama, and that the entire situation had the feel of authentic crisis rather than scripted performance. "That's a serious charge, Captain. Treason is not an accusation that any responsible officer makes lightly. What evidence do you have to support such claims? And why are you bringing this to me through irregular channels rather than through normal command structure?" Charlotte emerged from concealment, carrying her babies and Daniel's decoded journal, with the careful dignity of someone who understood she was making the most important presentation of her life. Sherman's eyebrows rose at the sight of a civilian woman with infants in what was clearly a military situation, but his expression showed curiosity rather than dismissal. "General Sherman," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "My name is Charlotte Mason. My husband was Daniel Mason. a civilian contractor who operated weapons caches for the Union Army under Colonel Hayes' command at Fort Harker. He was murdered 2 weeks ago by corrupt officers who are selling military supplies and intelligence to the enemy for personal profit. She handed Sherman the journal and her decoded translation, watching his face as he quickly scanned the evidence that had cost her husband his life. Sherman's expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the scope of the conspiracy revealed in Daniel's careful records, his military mind immediately grasping the strategic implications of the betrayals documented in the pages. Mrs. Mason, Sherman said after several minutes of intense study that demonstrated his ability to rapidly process complex information. If this information is accurate, then we're looking at systematic treason that has compromised multiple military installations throughout Kansas territory and potentially affected the outcome of major military operations. But I have to ask, how do I know this isn't Confederate disinformation designed to undermine confidence in Union command and create chaos in our rear areas? The question was fair but potentially devastating. Charlotte realized she needed to provide evidence that went beyond Daniel's records, proof that would convince Sherman of both the conspiracy's reality and her own credibility. She had anticipated this challenge and prepared accordingly. Lieutenant Morrison, she said, naming the key figure Daniel had identified as the primary source of intelligence leaks. He's Colonel Hayes' aide at Fort Harker. He has a small scar on his left hand from a knife accident he suffered as a child, and he always writes with his left hand because of an old shoulder injury from a writing accident. He also has a serious gambling problem that has left him deeply in debt to civilian contractors in Dodge City, who are known to have Confederate sympathies. The specific personal details clearly impressed Sherman, who understood that such intimate information could only come from direct observation or reliable intelligence gathering over an extended period. How do you know these details about Morrison? Did your husband share his suspicions with you? Because Daniel was investigating him for months before the attack on our farm. He suspected Morrison was the source of security breaches that were compromising cash operations, so he made it his business to learn everything possible about the man's habits, weaknesses, and associations. He was building a case methodically, gathering evidence that would be sufficient to convince a military tribunal. Sherman studied the journal again, this time paying closer attention to the methodical way Daniel had documented Morrison's activities, financial irregularities, and suspicious contacts. This is the work of someone with professional intelligence training, he observed with growing respect. Your husband wasn't just a farmer playing at soldier, was he? He served with the 5th Illinois Infantry for 3 years before taking his discharge to settle in Kansas. Charlotte admitted, providing information that she had kept private to protect Daniel's cover identity. He never completely stopped being a soldier, even when he was trying to build a farm and raise a family. The Army recruited him for cash operations because of his military experience and his ability to maintain cover as a civilian settler. What followed was swift and decisive action that demonstrated why Sherman had earned his reputation as one of the Union's most effective commanders and administrators. Within hours of reviewing Charlotte's evidence, telegraph messages were flying to every major military installation in Kansas territory and beyond, initiating investigations that would expose the full scope of the weapons theft conspiracy and its connections to Confederate intelligence operations. Sherman's response was characteristically thorough and methodical. He immediately dispatched trusted officers to secure all remaining weapons caches, placed key personnel under surveillance, and began the process of unraveling a conspiracy that had been operating for more than 2 years. His experience with military logistics and supply operations allowed him to quickly understand how the theft network had been organized and how it could be dismantled. Lieutenant Morrison was arrested at Fort Harker before he could destroy evidence or flee to Confederate territory. The speed and precision of his capture suggested that Sherman had moved immediately upon receiving Charlotte's information. understanding that delay would allow the conspirators to eliminate evidence and escape justice. Under intense interrogation by Sherman's most experienced intelligence officers, Morrison revealed the names of more than a dozen other conspirators, including civilian contractors, Confederate agents, and Union officers who had been selling military intelligence for personal profit. The corruption went deeper than we initially thought, Sherman told Charlotte as they waited for reports from the various arrests being conducted simultaneously across the territory. Morrison was just one link in a chain that stretched from here to Confederate headquarters in Richmond. The intelligence they were selling could have cost thousands of Union lives and potentially affected the outcome of major battles. The investigation revealed a network of treason that shocked even experienced military investigators. Cash operators had been systematically murdered to eliminate witnesses. Weapons had been sold to Confederate raiders who used them against Union forces, and detailed intelligence about troop movements had been provided to enemy commanders planning major operations. The conspiracy had been operating with the efficiency of a legitimate business, complete with established supply lines, secure communication methods, and carefully laundered financial transactions. Colonel Hayes himself was cleared of direct involvement in the conspiracy after a thorough investigation revealed that he had been deliberately isolated from information about cash operations by his own staff. However, his failure to detect the systematic corruption within his own command resulted in his removal from frontier duty and reassignment to administrative positions where his oversight responsibilities would be more limited. For Charlotte, the vindication of Daniel's work brought both satisfaction and profound sadness. Her husband had died protecting information that was crucial to Union victory, but he had also died alone, unable to share his discoveries with the woman who had loved him or see justice done for the crimes he had uncovered. The knowledge that his sacrifice had meaning provided comfort, but it couldn't fill the emptiness left by his absence. He was a hero in the truest sense, Sherman said, simply as he prepared to continue his inspection tour, now with enhanced security and a completely reorganized intelligence apparatus. His sacrifice helped preserve the Union and protect countless soldiers who never knew they were in danger. That's the kind of legacy any man would be proud to leave his children, and any woman would be honored to carry forward. But Sherman's recognition of Daniel's service brought practical benefits as well as emotional satisfaction. Charlotte was granted a military pension as the widow of a Union contractor killed in the line of duty, along with educational benefits for her children. That would ensure they had opportunities their parents had never dreamed of. More importantly, she was offered official recognition as a civilian intelligence specialist, with the possibility of future employment in code-breaking and analysis work. The offer reflected both Charlotte's proven capabilities and the Union Army's growing recognition that the war effort required talents that existed outside traditional military hierarchies. Her ability to decipher Daniel's complex coding system had impressed Sherman's intelligence staff, and they saw potential for applying those skills to other cryptographic challenges facing Union forces. What would you choose? She asked Ahanu as they prepared to leave the site where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The question carried weight beyond simple career decisions. It touched on fundamental choices about identity, purpose, and the kind of future she wanted to build for her children. I would choose whatever path allows your children to grow up free and strong, he replied, his words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that survival required adapting to change rather than fighting it. But I would also choose the path that honors the sacrifices made to bring you to this moment. Charlotte looked at her twins, now healthy and thriving after their difficult introduction to the world, then at the vast Kansas prairie that had tested her strength and rewarded her courage. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape according to their own values and aspirations, rather than the expectations of others. Then we choose freedom, she said, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she had proven herself capable of protecting what mattered most while contributing to causes larger than her own immediate survival. The woman who had given birth alone among the ashes of her burned homestead had become someone strong enough to bring down a conspiracy, secure justice for her husband's memory, and build a foundation for her children's future success in years to come. People would tell stories about the twins born in fire who grew up to become leaders in their own right, the boy who became a territorial judge, known for his unwavering integrity and innovative approaches to frontier law, and the girl who became one of the first female physicians on the frontier, combining traditional medical knowledge with techniques learned from her time among the Cheyenne. But those who knew their story understood that their strength came not from supernatural forces, but from a mother who had refused to let tragedy define their future, and a community of allies who had supported her when support meant the difference between survival and destruction. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the prairie grass whispered secrets only the land could remember, travelers would speak of seeing a Cheyenne warrior riding alongside a woman and 2 children, still protecting them as they built new lives from the ashes of the old, proving that some bonds forged in crisis become stronger than family, deeper than marriage, and more enduring than the conflicts that originally brought people together.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.